What's up everyone? Today we are going for a classic constructed ProQuest. It's the last ProQuest weekend of the season and I am playing an upgraded Armory deck. It is -IO and today's ProQuest is at a local game store called the Imaginarium, which is at Boat Quay here in Singapore. Okay, before we get into the games, I am going to do a very quick rundown of the deck that I brought for this tournament. It is technically still an upgraded Armory deck, and in the equipments, I've brought in Adaptive Plating for the 3-block, Crown of Providence to help fix my hand. I have the Heavy Industry Gear Shift as the leg piece from the Armory deck. I think it's great, the extra 1 block, as well as giving me an action point. And then Symbiosis Shot, which is the default weapon, and Teklo Foundry Heart, because I think the 2 Battle Wand really helps with blocking, and I activate this a lot as well to try and dig for items as well as get additional resources. Then in the main board, I have the 3 red backup protocols. These are great. I have 6 boom grenades, 3 red, 3 yellow, 3 cerebellum processors, 3 fast and furious, all from the Armory deck, and then 3 high octanes. This is a very key card in this deck. It's one of the power cards. I always want to pair this with either the cerebellum processors or multiple gunshots to make the most of the extra action points. And I'm also playing the full set of 3 maximum velocities, because this is actually a max velocity deck. I'm trying to play maximum velocity as many times as possible each game. Then we have 6 outpace, 3 red, 3 blue. I've brought in 3 pulse wave harpoons. This is the best disruptive boost card that we have. I brought in 3 Spark of Genius as well, which is a really powerful tutor that lets you draw a card most of the time as well. And there are 6 copies of T-Bones, 3 red and 3 blue. These are just great 0 cost boost cards that can snag an equipment block from your opponent, which can be quite crucial. And then 3 Teklo cores, the dash specialization item. These are great on turn 0 or when you're in the middle of a setup turn or ending the turn to try and set up for your next turn by giving you extra resources. I've also brought in 3 copies of Twin Drive. This pairs really nicely with max velocity, with high octanes, with pulse wave harpoons. I have all 9 copies of 0 to 60, I think these are in the Armory deck as well, and 6 copies of Zipper Hit, 3 red and 3 blue. So like I said, the main game plan is to play maximum velocity as many times as you can. Getting them back with backup protocol is really nice. Having extra action points from high octane to maybe do a double max velocity is also nice. And of course, sending them through with boom grenades is especially great. So that's why a lot of the boost cards are only 0 cost and 1 cost to kind of minimize the cost of the cards. Twin Drive is the exception because it boosts twice, so you don't need so many boost cards in order to hit the 3 boosts that you need for max velocity. But you can also have big turns with high octanes and multiple gunshots. So if your Symbiosis Shot has 5 or 6 counters and you just boost a couple times and you shoot for 5 times, 6 times, that's also a lot of damage. Now, I sideboarded for this event expecting a lot of decks to try and fatigue me out as well as the mirror match. In particular, I was expecting a lot of Enigmas, -IOs and a couple of Viserais, maybe some Nus and Auroras as well. So, Convection Amplifier, Hyper Scrapper, Heist, Tackle Pounders, these are all for the fatigue matchups where you want to play extra cards. Dissolution Sphere is there mostly for Aurora and Viserai, more so for Viserai I would say. And Signal Jammer is there for Azalea and maybe Kano. TikTok Clock obviously is for the mirror match, where you really want to destroy your opponent's items. And there's 3 extra equipment as well. Achilles Accelerator and Visiatronic gives me the 3 AB I need against Kano and other wizards. And Balance can come in against Brutes or the mirror match as well, where they do sometimes draw 2 cards to turn it on. And I also want to shout out some of the guys in this picture, even though I'm not in the picture, but David, Aloy, Jiazheng, Clinton, and Brandon, who's also not in the picture. Thank you so much for being such great testing partners and really helping me understand what this deck can do. So round 1 and I pair into a Rhinar, a Brute. To be honest, I don't have a lot of experience in this matchup, but I just brought in Balance of Justice in case he pulls off a Blood Rush Bellow turn. And I know that they pack a lot of arsenal disruption between sand packing and CNC. So honestly, I would rather not Arsenal a power card unless I really have to, or unless they have no cards in hand. But the early game was pretty straightforward. There was a lot of back and forth going on. Honestly, not a lot of blocking on my side. He did get a swing big in, which I didn't block at all. And he also sent in an Alpha Rampage on a follow-up turn that I just threw some armor in front of. So the game really pivoted on this turn, where I went High Octane, drew a card, and proceeded to play a second High Octane. Now, normally these aren't great in multiples, unless you have a lot of gunshots or Cerebellum on the field. And at this point, I did have a Cerebellum and a couple of bullets in my gun. So Twin Drive was a fantastic follow-up, boosting twice here, even getting a Fast and Furious trigger to get another Steam counter on the Cerebellum. So that brought me up to 5 action points, and here I find a Teclo Core off the top to put another counter on my gun. And these gun counters are really important on high octane turns because you want to shoot the gun as much as possible. I also activate the heart here. I like to do this when I have 1 resource left, just to dig a bit more and get an extra resource. And seeing a Spark of Genius on top, I activate the Cerebellum immediately to draw it and find another Cerebellum. Spark of Genius is just so good because it draws a card if you've boosted already. And then I go ahead and continue boosting, getting even more action points. And then I break the backup protocol here using the 2 float, getting back another T-Bone. So my plan here is actually to try and force him to use the Scowling Flashback, but my opponent doesn't do that, and so I just follow up with a Pulse Wave Harpoon. This is actually the second one of the game, and I take out the CNC from his hand, which is all red. And then since I have the action points, I go ahead and activate the Cerebellum one more time and boost again just to get in more damage, and then shoot the gun 5 times. So that turn threatened a total of 27 damage, and set me up with another Cerebellum and a Teclo Core for the next turn, and I still have an arsenal. So moving straight on to my next turn, I immediately crack the leg piece here just to get the action point, which is great when you have Cerebellums because you want to draw using them, you need action points for that. And I start once again by boosting. My opponent here blocks for 3 on a 4 powered attack, and thankfully I do find a Boom Grenade off the top, so that explodes in his face and nets me another action point. So my aim right now is to push through as much damage with the maximum velocity in my hand. I Spark of Genius for another red Boom Grenade, and I find another Spark of Genius off the top, so I use an action point to draw it with the Cerebellum. This time I do find a Teclo Core though, just to set up for the next turn, and then I continue boosting. At this point I still do have to play around the Scowling Flashback, but thanks to Cerebellum I have a lot of cards in hand. So I send in an outpace before the zipper hit, so that my hand right now is just actually 2 maximum velocities, and I have enough pitch already. So when he does send the Scowling Flashback, he intimidates one of the maximum velocities, which I'll just arsenal for the next turn, and I send the other one. So this goes through for 7 damage and triggers the red Boom Grenade. So that turn actually presented a total of 35 damage, of which 8 were from the 2 Boom Grenades, but they connected, which is the important thing, and which is why I think maximum velocity is just the best fit for this kind of deck. So at this point he was already at a very low life total. He had no armor, no card in arsenal. I had 2 Teclo Cores, 2 Cerebellums. So the final turn was very straightforward with the maximum velocity in my arsenal. I just boosted, and found another Cerebellum, played a Boom Grenade, and played max velocity for the win. Yeah, pretty interesting matchup. Had to play around the Scowling Flashback quite a lot. But I think overall, you just take all the damage that doesn't really disrupt your turns, and you try and send back a bit more, threaten some on hits, and of course get through the max Vs. Almost fatigued out, left 3 cards left in deck. But yeah, good round 1. There are 5 rounds today, so 4 more to go, and it's a full house. Okay, so round 2, and it's the mirror match. I win the die roll. I start by Spark of Genius into a Teclo Core, and honestly the first few turns were just not very interesting. We were just sending attacks. His build, I know from experience, is slightly different. He's playing like a Mara Ferris build, focusing on pushing through Boom Grenades with breakpoints. So the only thing I'm really worried about in the mirror match is the tick-tock clocks. If that hits and it blows up a Teclocore or a Cerebellum, it can be quite devastating. And on this turn, I actually sent in quite a lot of damage, 3 boost attacks as well as a gunshot, and he didn't block, he kept his whole hand, and he played out a boom grenade, followed up by a boost card, which I simply didn't block. And I think this surprised him a bit because he was expecting me to block out for the boom grenade. So after that, he didn't really have much of a follow-up. He IP'd himself, I think. And from there, it was just a bit more trading. We were just sending boost attacks, and I managed to get a Teclocore out. He managed to get a Cerebellum out. But then I had a pretty good hand where I had High Octane and a Cerebellum in hand. So I went into my High Octane turn, boosted a couple of times. And here my opponent decides to give up 2 armor to block for 3 against my 4 powered attack. And in response, I activate Dio, getting a tick-tock clock off the top, and that hits and blows up his Cerebellum processor. And then I see another High Octane on the top of my deck, so I play out my own Cerebellum processor from hand, use an action point to draw that High Octane, and just send in a Heist to threaten an on-hit effect, and arsenal my High Octane. So at this point, my opponent had already used up 2 of his Cerebellums. He'd been blocking quite a bit, but once again he threatened another boom grenade and sent 2 4-powered attacks. I blocked the first one and then I just take the second one. I proceed to play out my second High Octane turn, boosting a couple of times once again, and then setting up a boom grenade for the next turn, as well as putting down another tick-tock clock. But the important thing here is that I got to fire off my pistol twice as well, using the High Octane action points, and arsenal my third High Octane for next turn. Once again, my opponent's turn was quite straightforward. He put down a boom grenade and he sent in 2 attacks with breakpoints, which I managed to comfortably block out using the rest of my armor. And at this point, my opponent was down to like 4 life, I think, and with that red boom grenade on my arena, all I had to do was send enough breakpoints at him, and so with the help of my Cerebellum processor and the last High Octane, I drew enough breakpoint boost cards to get that through. The meta now, there are actually 5 Dash IOs. So this bunch of people are actually the Dash IO people. They're all talking about Dash IO now. It's a Dio gang. And yeah, should be doing well. I think the other most represented hero is Enigma on 6 players. So we'll see how it goes. Round 3 up next. Well, round 3 I paired into my first Enigma of the day. And this time, my opponent won the die roll, started off with a truce and immediately transcended. So fantastic turn 0. My turn wasn't bad as well. I managed to boost, find a Teclocore off the top, and then set up a Teclo Pounder. And for this matchup into Enigma, I bought in 7 cards because I always expect them to fatigue me. But my opponent actually got quite aggressive, sending a Levels of Enlightenment, along with an Astral Etchings on a Spectral Shield and a Weakest Link all in one turn. So I actually gave my Crown of Providence to swap out the item in my hand to prevent the Weakest Link's effect. The game was actually quite balanced for a while after that. I did have a High Octane Cerebellum turn, but unfortunately I couldn't find a maximum velocity. Instead, I had to settle for a Pulse Wave Harpoon that took out a Phantasmaclasm from my opponent's hand. But he continued to try and keep cards in hand and actually attacked me with a Enigma Chimera. But then on my turn, I go straight into a High Octane turn, drawing the maximum velocity that's on top of my deck. And of course, my aim is always to send a max velocity every game. So I boost a card and then play out a Cerebellum. And you always want to pair these Cerebellums with High Octanes whenever possible. So I use that AP to draw another boost card off the top. And I also find a Boom Grenade off the top, which is great because I plan to send a maximum velocity. He does have a sink below to cover up one of the 0 to 60s, but I continue boosting and end off with a max velocity. And after a while, he manages to figure out a block using a Mirai as well as the Meridian Pathway and a CNC from hand to completely block out my maximum velocity turn. Even after all that blocking, my opponent has a card to play. It's a Rage Spectre and he attacks me for 6, which I decide to just take, and at this point we are both quite even on life totals. I think it was 11 to 15. And unfortunately my hand is kind of a bricked hand. I have 2 items, a max velocity and a High Octane. I do find a backup protocol off the top. And I actually decided to just pitch to get back a twin drive from my graveyard and set up a big max V next turn, possibly with Dominate because of the convection amplifier, but I could have also just gotten back something to try and clear the Rage Spectre off the board, so I basically don't attack him at all. And I draw up into a pretty crazy hand that would let me high octane into max velocity into pistol shots. And my opponent once again sends a red Enigma Chimera at me. This one is for 8 damage. And of course this has Phantasm, and with the max velocity in hand I can pop it. But after considering, I decide to just go for the win. I didn't think he could kill me at this range. Unfortunately, I thought I was the one at 15, but I was actually at 11, and he pitches and sends in a blue pummel, and then he flips open his arm piece to give it +1. So it's actually an 11 power attack now, and of course I don't have any defense reactions, so I am just dead. Well, so round 3 is over. My winning streak has come to an end against Enigma of all heroes. Pretty bad game. I think I was just kind of overconfident. I had all the right tools, I was doing quite well, and I was setting up for a kill turn, but unfortunately I kind of bricked on my hand with a couple of items and max V, and he sent me a 2-cost attack with Phantasm that I chose not to pop, and he went into a blue pummel and then used the arm piece to give it a +1, and that was lethal. So yeah, I died, but it's okay. It was a good learning experience. Quite an aggressive Enigma actually. And 2 more rounds to go. Round 4, round 5, round 4, round 5. So I think if I win the next one, I might be locked for top 8. But I'm just gonna try and win them both. So yeah, round 4. Let's go. Round 4, and I pair into another Enigma. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this one because this was a more typical Enigma strategy. My opponent was just trying to fatigue me out, and he actually had the red Essence of Ancestry, which put in a lot of work because in addition to the Ward 2, he played 2 of them and they both actually prevented 2 red boom grenades. So he got 6 points of value out of each of them, and he also sent back-to-back CNCs, which forced me to block quite a bit. So my first higher octane turn wasn't super impactful, but I forced him to block out because of the threat of 2 red boom grenades. From then on, the second higher octane I found came with a Spark of Genius that found me my first Cerebellum, which gave me a lot more gas. And he was still blocking out because of 1 red boom grenade. I was also threatening on hits with a Heist. But the important thing is that I was chipping through damage with my Symbiosis shots thanks to the extra action points from high octane. At this point, he still managed to set up a board state with 2 Spectral Shields and the second red Essence of Ancestry, but I managed to break through with the first maximum velocity of the game. And the game basically ended in the next 2 turns when I went consecutive maximum velocities in both turns. And although it does seem kind of easy to just say that, you just play a maximum velocity, there were a lot of convoluted lines leading up to the maximum velocities, including what to search with Spark of Genius. Sometimes it was a Cerebellum, sometimes it was a backup protocol, and things like what do you draw off the Cerebellum with the extra action points, because sometimes you're looking for a 0-cost boost, sometimes you're looking for resources. So yeah, the lines to get to the maximum velocity are really quite complicated, but I do think that this is one of the best ways to push through decks that are trying to fatigue -IO. What's his round? Alright, so that's the end of round 4. Hey Brandon, you gave me the high octane playmat, thank you so much. Shout out to Amokyo Game 7. Shout out to the TO. And looking forward to the last round. I should be locked for top 8.
For X1, not for me.
You still got chance.
I need to win the last one.
Maybe.
Like, win the last one.
And then see the tiebreakers.
Yeah, the tiebreakers.
Alright, so round 5 next. Okay, so round 5, and it's against a Viserai. I win the die roll. I start by playing a Tackle Call from hand. Fantastic setup. My opponent also starts out by setting up a Malefic Incantation into a Snuff Out, which is one of my most hated cards. So I just block it out. So into Viserai games, it can be quite a challenge to figure out what your opponent is doing, because they can quite easily pivot from an aggressive to a defensive strategy or vice versa. And it's possible for them to fatigue you, and it's also possible for them to race you. So my strategy is always to try and attack them as much as possible, see how many defense reactions they're running, see how many 4 blocks they might have in their deck, and of course just notice whether or not they are trying to play defensively or offensively. And in this case, my opponent shows me an early sink below, so I do think that he is a bit more on the defensive side, which means that I am preparing to maybe take a couple of off turns to set up for bigger turns in order to push through damage. You also always have to be aware of succumb to temptation, so sometimes pitching into the accelerator to prevent the arcane stops them from playing that at instant speed, or just using your armor and blocking efficiently to prevent the attack from hitting so that succumb doesn't trigger is also important. So the game kind of swung in my favor when I found my first high octane. I managed to pair that with 3 boost attacks, and my opponent just started blocking out because there was the threat of a boom grenade. But once again, the important thing is that I managed to shoot the gun 3 times, chipping in for a bit of damage and set up a max velocity in my arsenal for next turn. So my opponent can't do much, just sends the Reaping Blade at me with a rune chant, and my turn is to start by playing a backup off the top, cracking it immediately to get a 0 to 60, and from there I basically just send in 0 cost boost, 2 T-bones and a 0 to 60, and finish up by pitching to the Teklo Foundry Heart, getting 2 resources and sending in the first maximum velocity of the game. Nothing much happens during the next turn. I basically boost and then set up a boom grenade for the next turn. So my opponent does block with 2 cards, so he just sends in an attack, which I just don't block. So next turn I find a Cerebellum off the top, crank it to get the action point, and then I boost a 0 to 60 so that when I play the Spark of Genius, I can draw a card. With the Spark, I do find another Cerebellum, and then I go Twin Drive, boosting twice into the second maximum velocity of the game. I do think that I should have sparked for a boom grenade instead of the second Cerebellum because I didn't actually get the value from it, so that might have been a better line. So at this point my opponent is at a pretty low life total. I've already had 2 big turns, and I start by going high octane, drawing a card, and finding the last Cerebellum off the top. And seeing that the top of my deck is a Twin Drive, I use an action point to draw it, then I start boosting. I have very few cards in deck, so my aim here is to really maximize the action points to shoot the Symbiosis shot as much as possible. I do find another boom grenade which I draw and play out because I know that I can push it through this turn, and I just keep boosting with breakpoints. I draw another card of the Cerebellum for another 0 for 4 and finish off with an outpiece, and finally shoot the gun 5 times for the win. So that last turn threatened a total of 34 damage, which just goes to show the power of 1 high octane and 3 Cerebellums. You just draw so many cards, get so many action points. So just got there, very exciting game, and definitely locked for top 8 now. So let's see how top 8 goes.
Okay, so 5th is Jason, 4th is Aspen, 3 is Jack, Jose coming second, and Rikyo in first.
Yay! Alright, so top 8, and I didn't have time to record in between games because these were just played back to back to back. And I'm just going to go through these really quickly because you've pretty much seen all the plays already. You know that this is a maximum velocity deck. And in the quarterfinals, it was a rematch from round 5. It was the same Viserai opponent. This time, I put more cards in the deck because I knew he was going to try and fatigue me, basically. Thankfully for me, this time I found my Cerebellums faster, my max velocities faster. But I do want to run through this last turn that I had, and he was already blocking a lot. He was quite a low life as well. I started with a high octane and I boosted a 0 to 60. And my hand was kind of bricky, but I did have a Cerebellum on the board. So when I saw the Spark of Genius on top, I drew into it. And this time I found a backup protocol. And from the first Spark of Genius, I actually drew into a second Spark of Genius. And I used that to find myself a red boom grenade. And then I pitched to crack the backup protocol, getting back a maximum velocity to hand, before proceeding to boost and keep boosting before activating the Foundry Heart to go into a maximum velocity, and then with the help of Achilles Accelerator to shoot the pistol 3 times for lethal. So that was actually a 38 damage turn, and I believe this game ended on either turn 5 or 6. So, semifinals, and this was into Enigma, but this was actually a Count Your Blessings Enigma. Unfortunately for my opponent, I didn't know he was on Count Your Blessings until the last 2 turns of the game when he was almost dead. So I think it went about 7 or 8 turns long, and he only found 2 Count Your Blessings. So yeah, it was another straightforward fatigue kind of matchup. I put in extra cards in the deck. But I do want to run through one of the turns where I had a rather strange hand with a Spark of Genius, a Max Velocity, 1 boost card and 1 item. So I did also have a red Boom Grenade in Arsenal, which is how I started the turn. And I also started with a Cerebellum as well as a Teclo Core on the arena, so I had 2 resources floating. And of course my aim here is to get the max velocity off. So how I did it was I started by playing out the Boom Grenade and then boosting. And of course I needed more boost cards, so I followed up with a Spark of Genius in order to get a backup protocol out of my deck. Then I used the 2 floating to get the 0 to 60 from my graveyard back to my hand. And then, seeing that the top of my deck was another 0 to 60, I decided to crack the Achilles Accelerator here in order to get that 1 extra action point to activate the Cerebellum and draw that 0 to 60. And after boosting the first 0 to 60, I actually see another Cerebellum off the top, so I activate Dio and play it off the top. Then I boost with the other 0 to 60 before activating the Foundry Heart to get my 2 resources. I put down another Boom Grenade and then the Max V. So there's a red and a yellow boom plus the Max V that's threatening a total of 17 damage. All in all, I presented a total of 29 damage, and I still had an extra action point that I could use for Cerebellum in order to draw an Arsenal. So someone actually mentioned to me after the game that when he looked at my hand, he thought it was just a complete brick. So I think it just goes to show how complex the lines can be for Dio. And from there, the game just continued on. I kept pressuring, but I didn't really have another huge spike turn until right at the end where I found my final high octane, and it really went down all the way to the final card in my deck before I managed to win the game. Okay, and we are finally at the finals, and it is an all-IO finals, and my opponent is higher seeded, so he chose to go first, set up an early Cerebellum, but I also managed to set up a Teclo Core. And like I said previously, I think this matchup is really based on the TikTok clocks. And unfortunately for me, my opponent found his first clock first. So it was threatening my Teclo Core. Thankfully, he only had 2 4-powered attacks, so I could use my equipment and cards from hand to block that out and still have a crackback. And my turn was really interesting because at this point he has 2 Cerebellums on field as well as a Teclo Core, and I start my turn by boosting a red T-Bone. He gives me equipment for that. I don't really care because I just go into Spark of Genius, and here I find a TikTok clock and crank it. And after this, I basically send 2 0 for 4s followed by a backup protocol using the Teclo Core resources to crack it and getting another 0 for 4. So my opponent basically gives up his entire armor suite and his whole hand pretty much, except for a Spark of Genius, in order to protect his items. But that also means that he doesn't really get the full value out of them. So this is an interesting dynamic in the mirror match, which is why I think TikTok Clock is just so strong. And also maybe it's a good reason to not find so many powerful items early on in the mirror match. But anyway, that kind of swings the tempo of the game really heavily in my favor. And from then on, I go on to find another Spark of Genius into my own Cerebellum, and then I go into a double high octane turn and just win the game from there. Okay, I'm gonna open this. Open this way, right? What can I get?
What do you wish for?
What do you wish for?
What do I wish for?
Achilles for?
Achilles,
Go.
Achilles.
It's common to of course, we wish for the M.
Do I just open it?
Yeah.
Oh, you want to throw the dustbin down?
Alright, let's go.
Oh, is Achilles inside this? Because Achilles is the MG.
Yes, yes, yes.
It's actually a bender.
Max is good. Keto. Alright, so I'm actually home already. I didn't have time to record during the top 8, but we made it all the way, won the gold foil and the invite to London next year. Really, really tiring. I think playing this deck is quite strenuous mentally, but very fun. The goal is, of course, to try and max velocity or high octane, get some of these big turns. I think you need like 3 big turns to really push through enough damage. And the lines are just so complicated, but so interesting and really rewarding when you figure it out. So yeah, that's all the gameplay. And thanks for watching. See you in London.